Hi, I'm Caroline Levitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun just when the pandemic came in to help independent bookstores, writers who lost their tours, who needed more publicity, and readers too, of course. I'm thrilled today because not only do we have a great writer and a great book, but it's a friend of mine, Wade Rouse, The Magic Season, A Sun Story, which is such a great, great book. You won't believe it. And I just want to clear something up at first because some people have been asking. Wade Rouse is actually the same person as Viola Shipman. So we're going to talk about that as soon as I give Wade's introduction. So Wade Rouse is the USA Today, Publishers Weekly, and internationally best-selling author of 13 books, including 4 memoirs and 9 novels. His book, The Secret of Snow, was an instant national and indie bestseller. His books have been translated into 21 languages and have been bestsellers across the world. He chose his grandmother's name, Viola Shipman, as a pen name to honor the working poor Ozarks woman whose heirlooms and family stories inspire his fictions. And the Viola Shipman books are wonderful as his memoirs, very different, but equally wonderful. Wade's going to publish 3 books in 2022, including Magic Season, his first memoir in a decade. It's about how the love of baseball was the only thing to bond him and his very conservative Ozarks father. Wade will also publish his new summer novel, The Edge of Summer, inspired by his grandmother's button jars in July, as well as an upcoming winter holiday novel. So here we go with a lot of the titles: The Summer Cottage, The Clover Girls, The Charm Bracelet, The Hope Chest, The Recipe Box, The Heirloom Garden, and there's more. Wade's books have been selected as must reads by NBC's Today Show, featured in the Washington Post, Chelsea lately, chosen 3 times as Indie Next Picks, and more. And he hosts the wonderful Facebook Live Literary Happy Hour, Wine and Words with Wade, every Thursday at 6:30. Wade, I'm thrilled to have you here. Welcome. Thank you for being here with your wonderful book.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be with you. It's good to see you again. I wish we could do this on a daily basis.
Well, we can. We'll just never get any work
We
done.
never ever. We just babble like we've been doing the last 15 minutes.
We'll make videos. So I want to talk about this book because I love it. This book is really about a father and a son. Your father was very much a rural Ozarkian, and he was not happy that you were gay when you came out of the closet. He was not happy that you married Gary, and he was not happy that you became a writer. But when your father started to get sick, you and your father began to be bonded by baseball. So I wanted to know, first of all, I wanted to know the why now moment of writing this particular memoir. I sort of know the answer, but I think people listening would want to know too.
Wow, that's a great question. I say that this is probably of any book that I've written the most heart-wrenching and life-affirming book that I've ever tried to write, and it took me a number of years. I think why now? Every book that I write is kind of led by what I call a big question. It's something that I'm grappling with, or that I want to answer. I think maybe readers are as well. And over the last couple of years, as you know, and we've all experienced, there's been so much loss, over a million lives to COVID, and people have lost those they've loved, and also lost them oftentimes without having a chance for closure.
Right.
And for me, I had closure in my life with my father, and I wanted to wait long enough until I could kind of process his loss, our relationship, and really, I come from that old school. I call it the Irma Bombeck school of writing, which is humor with family issues, but it's also, I seek to always understand in nonfiction and not to blame. My goal is always to try to understand how we become the people that we do, and that's all the ghosts on our shoulders, all the things that have happened in our past, make us who we are, and what we do, and what we say, and how we dress, and what we eat. And I I was fascinated by over, especially the last few years of spending time as my father's caregiver, how he became the person he did. And a lot of it was his fault and not his fault. You know, a man, an engineer born in the 50s, um, unable to express emotion in the small town
Right.
community in which he was raised, unable to have any role models that were gay or even how to talk about something like that. So I tried to understand how he became the way he did rather than just blame him, which is what he did to me much of his life was, you know, blame me for being different, blame me for being hard, blame me for not just following along in life and making it easy.
Yeah, with people who do that, I think it does. I think you're right. I think it does have a lot to do with how they were raised, what they were taught, how they feel
Environment.
about them. Yeah, and how they feel about themselves. One of the things that struck me about your memoir was I felt that you were saying that we can, with struggle and with understanding, become our best selves, not just because of who our fair family is and how they treat us, but in spite of it. And I think understanding is sort of the line underneath that that ties it all together. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. You know, that was honestly one of the very first things that I wrote down was, did I become the man I was because of my father or in spite of my father? And there's a big, big difference there
Yeah.
in looking at how we become who we are. And to me, it was both. You know, as we were talking before we went live, hardship in life can crush you, and it often does. Or and you can use that to see yourself in a new light, to set
Hmm.
out on your own, to start anew. And, you know, growing up, the foundation of this book is, you know, all we want as children, and you know this, is we want acceptance and unconditional love. That's
Right.
all we want and really desire, especially in our deepest relationships. And when we don't get that, when we yearn for it and we fight for that every single day, it both it both crushed me and also set me free in many ways. When I was able to get out into the world, and you're already going to make me cry, but when I was able to get out into the world, I remember one of my best friends from college, a guy from St. Louis who still remains one of my best friends, the straightest man in the world. Um, and he he knew and understand who I was almost immediately, and told me to be proud of myself, and not to feel that shame. And you know, you start to hear that, and you see yourself in a new light, and it not only encourages and emboldens you, but it set me free to be proud of who I was. And I have to say this, and we were talking about this as well. My mother and grandmothers did that as well. You know, they
Right.
didn't really know how to talk to me about who I was, but they certainly knew I was different, and they took me in and and just showered me with love and told me that I was good and that I was smart and that I was different and that was okay.
That's amazing. And how did your father react and relate to all these women in your family? Did he
It
just
was
say, "Oh, the women folk"?
that's what they said, the women folk. You know, yeah, you know, everybody, you know, all the men would be in oftentimes, you know, drinking beer or whatever, and the women folk would be in the kitchen baking or making Sunday dinner. And my dad, it was interesting. I kind of feel like my father got everything thrown at him that he never imagined would happen. You know, he married a woman, my mother, who I think he believed would kind of conform to society at that time. And my mother was, as I write about a lot, one of the smartest. You know, I don't like to put people on pedestals, but my mother was close to a saint as I'll ever know. She, a nurse, and later in her career, a hospice nurse, um,
Oh,
who taught me all about not living with regret and unconditional love. But she spoke her mind. I mean, they got married and she started volunteering for the Kennedy campaign, which stunned my father in the Ozarks. You know, these are things we didn't do down there. She volunteered for Obama's campaign. She really,
wow.
you know, those were not things he bargained for. He did not bargain for me to be gay. And, you know, I lost my brother when he was 17 and I was 13, and my dad did not bargain for, I believe, the son who could have given him everything he thought he
Right,
wanted.
that he thought he wanted. That's right.
All of that, my father, as an engineer and as a Ozarks guy, shut down. He just, if a Cardinals game was bad, he would turn it off. If something bad was happening in life, he would grab a beer and walk out of the room. So that's how he dealt with it. He didn't deal until later in life. My mother and I began to challenge him a lot.
That is so great. While you were writing this book, I imagine there would be parts where you would tear up and you would have to stop and put it away and then come back. How difficult was it to finish this? And what surprised you as you were writing it?
This was fairly nightmarish at times.
Oh,
You, I, there would be times, in fact, when I started writing this book, my editor, John Glenn at Hanover Square, was fascinated by the idea and wanted some initial pages. And I sat down and about 20 pages came spilling out of me, pretty much what is the start of the book, based on notes I'd taken for decades. And I was bawling as I was writing. And I'm a dramatic, I cry at dog food commercials, but the keyboard was soaked as I was writing, but I couldn't stop either. And it was everything that you hold inside for so long. Um, as a writer, you're able to give it your full all and your full emotion, and I it just was so difficult. And I would have to stop. There would be times I'd write a paragraph and I would have to walk away, or I'd get half a page, and as you stop and you have to take
right.
yoga breaths and pull it together. But I knew, as you know, when that happens, or when you're laughing hysterically, that you're onto something
That's right.
real.
Yeah, I think you probably had a chemical change in your DNA from writing this because it's so. I mean, I always say that writers are like canaries in the coal mine where we go to the dangerous parts and hopefully we come out alive. And reading this, it was so honest. And it's like you went there. You always want the writers to go there, and you did. And I think that's why it was so moving and so powerful and also so universal. I mean, I was thinking about and crying about my mom when I
Mm.
was reading this. I haven't reached the point of doing that for my dad yet, but for my mom, definitely. So let's talk about baseball. Okay, so you didn't play sports, which was something your dad just did not like that you weren't a sports person. Um, and he hated when you came out. He hated that you married Gary. But baseball, what was it about baseball that you liked? And what was it, beside the fact that it connected you to your dad? And just talk about that relationship because that's so interesting. This book actually is written in innings, which is part of like just the enchantment of the book itself.
Yeah, I always say growing up, there are three things an Ozarks boy has to learn to do. He has to learn to fish, to hunt, and to play baseball. And my dad, I write about, tried like the Dickens to teach me to play, and it did not work well. My hand didn't fit well in the glove. He would stand out in our woods and throw me the ball, and it would go sailing over my head. And the scrapbooks. Yeah, I mean, everybody knew if you look at our scrapbooks, it's me trying to look sporty and holding the glove and the baseball flying over my head. And I remember one time my dad said, he threw his glove to the ground and he said, "You'll never learn to play baseball and you'll never be a real man." And it
That's a terrible thing to say to a child.
it crushed me. And I stood there and I knew that I couldn't cry because that would make me look weaker in his eyes. And he always had a six pack, and he grabbed it and walked inside and started watching a Cardinals game. And I stood, for a long time. I would stand in the shadows and kind of watch him watching a baseball game or listening to it. And I think in the beginning, I just wanted his approval, acceptance. He'd always pat the end of the couch and the dog would jump on. And I think I wanted him to pat the couch and have me join him. And I just started listening to the games. And, baseball it's not changed. It's a thinking man's game. It is, as I write in this book, it's the tiny decisions that are made from inning to inning that decide the final score. and that's exactly the way life is. And
That's right.
I became fascinated with, something that I couldn't do that others were great at. Kind of like I used to admire other authors as well. Oh my gosh, they can do something I really can't do. And I started asking my dad questions about it. What's an RBI? What's an ERA? And the first thing he taught me was how to score a card. So I sat down with him and he taught me how how
Wow.
to how to score a baseball card, and that stuck with me. And I just the little things that my dad taught me about the game, like you don't always swing for the fences. Sometimes it's better to move a man up a base, or hit a sacrifice fly, or take ball four instead of trying to get a hit. Those little things. And it impacted me a lot as a kid because baseball was sports wise similar to reading to me. I always had a book, but this was a slow game. You could see the calculated moves, what the pitchers were throwing, why they threw it, how the players were arranged on the field defensively. It all started to make sense to me, and I became a huge fan. And you know, one day my dad patted the couch, and I took a seat, and
Oh,
that's that was our we didn't ever talk much about life, but we certainly talked about baseball players that we loved over the years. And it became kind of a rallying cry and uniter for us. And the fascinating thing has been I've heard from, so many of my readers are women, and I've heard from so many men with this book that just talk about how it could be football or baseball or hockey, basketball, or even going out to play golf with their dad or their son. They're not saying anything to each other, but they're next to each other.
right.
And that defines so much of how men express love in the world today. So it was, baseball for us was always how we talked and didn't talk. And even when I came out to my dad, he didn't talk to me for 2 years. Um, After I met Gary, he wrote me a letter, said that essentially I was going to hell, that I would be living in darkness, I would lose my job, I would lose my friends. That out of that fearful way of thinking that's so
Right.
believed. And Gary said, we're putting that in a box under our shoes we don't wear, never looking at that again. And he didn't talk to me. And I remember I used to go out I would leave work. I worked at, Washington University in St. Louis. And I would leave when I was a PR director, I would leave and I'd cry in my car because I wasn't talking to him. It had hurt. My mother was, but it had damaged our relationship. And I thought he was the cruelest human being in the world. And then when Mark McGuire for the Cardinals hit his 70th home run, my dad called me out of the blue after 2 years and said to me, he didn't do it alone. It takes a team. And I knew that was his apology. And many people didn't understand why I returned, but there are
Yeah, it makes sense.
there are some people that in this world. My dad was a smart man. My dad was an emotional man that did not know how really to express it. And I knew there was a kernel in him that if you didn't give up, perhaps he had the transformational ability to change, and he did.
But actually, it was you who started that change by watching and by commenting and by asking questions. I don't know if your father would ever have said, "Come here, I want to tell you something about the game," if you hadn't made that first move, which was so brave, just so, so brave.
Thank
I
you,
want,
and about life too.
yeah.
It became an entry point to talk about stories of his childhood or of my grandparents, or why he was interested in engineering, or why he liked to fish, or the first girl he ever kissed, whatever it was. And those things started to make me see him not as um, a monster, but as a man. And that was crucial for me. I have a probably a weakness and a superhuman power that I believe in the goodness of people. And it can bite me in the butt a lot of the time, but it didn't with me at the end.
There's a lot about your partner and also my friend, I'm happy to say Gary in the book. He's furious at your father, but you forgive because you say, well, he's your dad. Even when he did things like he removed you from his will and he rejected Northwestern for you
Yeah.
without giving you a chance for that. But the interesting thing about Gary is there was one extraordinary scene where Gary wants your dad to tell you he loves you and he can't do it. I wanted you to talk about that because that when I got to that scene, I was literally shaking because I was so moved and horrified and sad and all
No.
kinds of emotions.
Yeah, my dad did some pretty awful things to me
Mm,
over the course of my life. He removed me from the will. He sabotaged my acceptance to Northwestern's graduate school. Um, and I know it was part monetary. I know it was part jealousy in many ways. But yeah, there was a moment in which my father came to visit and went to a Cardinals game, and both my dad, no matter how hungover he was, would still get up at the crack of dawn and make coffee. And Gary still to this day gets up at the crack of dawn. And they were talking one day, and Gary said to my dad, I want you to tell your son how proud you are of him. And my dad couldn't. He could never, ever do that. I mean, he didn't understand why I was the way I was. He didn't understand why I did the work that I did, my interests, anything. And Gary, when my dad refused, Gary said, I will tell your son how proud I am of him until he starts to believe it. Um, and, you know, meeting Gary was one of the most happenstance and best things that ever happened in my life. We probably were never supposed to meet. It was wrong timing. Gary was newly sober. I was newly out. It just, nothing was supposed to work. And yet he was the most honest, transparent human being that I've ever met and still known in my life. And, that honesty was frightening for me coming from the family that I grew up with.
right.
Somebody that's so transparent with every emotion, that's so honest with every feeling. I was like, how the hell do I deal with this every day? And yet that saved my soul. And his honesty with my father saved my dad too.
I think
They
so
ended up
too.
they gave each other things that his father did not give him, and Gary's father gave me things my dad never gave me. So that was, it was a seminal moment in my life, and I'm glad that my ear was to the door.
Yeah, it's incredible. There's one other thing that you talk about in that scene, which is people who cannot show their emotions or they cannot approve of you. Your advice was to just love on them hard, love without, and I loved that. And that actually made me feel a lot better about some of my family members because it releases a lot of feelings that you have to do something, you have to change them, and you don't. Just give them love and step back and protect yourself. That must have been really hard to realize that truth, and I think it is a truth.
It's you just summed it up beautifully. It is, you love them hard, but sometimes you can't change them. It could be
Right.
environment, it could be background, whatever it is. And you do have to step aside and let them hopefully live and grow as much as you've had. We both, I'm sure we're very similar, and we had paths that were so different than what our parents had.
Oh, yeah.
And it changed us profoundly. When I went to Northwestern, being surrounded by people that were so different and so smart and so diverse and so non-judgmental, it was eye-opening. And it changed me so much. And that's, with my father, that's what I decided to do. You love on him hard, and then see how that goes. But you can't go in and change the foundation of a person
That's right.
immediately. And that's what we all kind of want to do. Love me now and change this second. And it doesn't happen like that. That's not what happens.
So, what advice would you have for kids? I mean, I worry a lot about America, especially kids growing up in rural areas, and in red states. What advice would you give for kids who haven't been out of their small town and they don't see a way out? I mean, what is there for them where they can? Is it like just going online and seeing that there's other worlds, or reading, or
I think that's a huge part of it. For me growing up in the 70s and rural America, there was no role model. There was no one. No one was spoken of. There was no books that I picked up that I could read. And I think that's exactly it. Knowing that there are people out there, seeing folks like us online or in the news, knowing that there are people like us out there
right,
that
right?
love you. I always, the story I've rarely told, but I went back to a small town where I'd grown up, and I was asked to be a speaker at a at a at a community college, and it was called a talent program, and it was for kids from rural America who were getting scholarships to be the very first generation of their family to go to college.
Wow.
They're from Nebraska and Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas. And at the very end of my speech, the kids could ask questions. These were high school juniors and seniors. And there was a boy that came up to the microphone and started bawling before he even got a word out of his mouth. And he goes, "You made it out. You made it out. How did you do that? How does that happen?" And I started just saying the first thing is that you're here and you're going to college. And let me say these are children who the administrator said a large majority of the parents did not want them to go to school. They did not want them to leave home. They did not want them to leave them. I think it's called the was it the Lobster Effect, where you start to get to the top and you're grabbed and pulled back
Crabs
down.
in a barrel, crabs
Crabs
in a
in a barrel.
barrel, right.
And so that's exactly what it was. And I had a huge long conversation with this boy, and it stayed in touch with him over the
I was
years.
just gonna ask you that.
And he went on to a 4-year college. He's gone on to get a nice job. He is living in a city. It is that type of support and acceptance and love that it has to be demonstrated every single day. These kids have to see it. On the flip side, I got an email from a reader whose son committed suicide at the age of 14 because he was gay. You I was a lucky one. I tried to take my own life at one point. Um I I struggle every day to try and do exactly what you say, which is to give back and reach out and try and help help people as much as I can, because you never know that you never know that moment.
Right, who it's going to impact, and I think this book does. I mean, that's why I think, like, what not only was this book such a pleasure to read and funny and moving, but it's so important because there's so many people who have relationships like this with their family, or they don't feel like they belong, and it's just inspiring, totally inspiring.
And that's interesting. You talked about you kind of I think as writers, we always try to we do a unique voice and perspective for a story or a book, but also one that we think has kind of universal appeal or effect that can kind of branch out. And with this book as well, I've gotten so many emails already from women that they were red-haired and freckled in a family of beautiful blondes and didn't fit in, or they were
Right.
expected to be dancers and they were tomboys. Whatever it was, whatever makes you different and doesn't fit in as hard as a kid. And I say that makes you, and I tell them all that makes you beautiful. The worst thing we do is try to fit in and try to
Right.
be like everyone else, because then we're losing those unique gifts that we have.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I also think that part of the power of this book is that you dug deep. I keep saying that you dug deep. You went to the most painful parts of you to tell your story, and I think that's what makes it universal. Because people say, "Oh my God, if he can think about this and tell this story and come out of it, then maybe so can I." And
And
that's a gift. That's a really important thing.
thank you. That's, I have to say, there were points where I wanted to stop and not go as far as I did in talking about my emotions or my relationships. But it doesn't. Readers are smart, and they they know when you're going surface. They understand when you're not digging deep into your own life or a character's life. And so there were moments where I would take a week or two and just think, how much do I want to share, and do I know in my heart that it's honoring my relationship with my father, but also could help someone else.
Right. Exactly, exactly. I have one more question for you before we take other questions, and it's about we were talking before this interview about the Viola Shipman books, Who Is You, and the Wade Rouse memoirs are so different. And I said, well, what? Do you go into one different head of thought? How do you juggle the two? And you had like such a great answer that I'd like to hear it here.
Yeah, it's not like I throw on a wig and a house coat and go into Viola. It is I would say all of my books are foundationally the same. They're very different, but foundationally they're all about family. They're all about unconditional love. They're all about our relationships. And I the hard part is I write um, memoir very different than I write fiction. I approach them very differently, not only as far as voice goes, but how I structure, how I write. I am much more linear in writing a novel than I am in approaching a memoir. I could write page 200, you know, at some point, just because there is a story that's aching to get out of me that I know I can fit in to the book at some point. I don't do that as much in fiction. I try very much to stay in one path. But the books, Wade Rouse and Viola Shipman are the same person, and um, I just try to write the best story I can from my heart. That's anything that calls to me. That's what I want to write about.
Can we have a question, Ollie? Ollie is a wonderful producer. Hard question. Your dad always had a beer or six pack in your memories. Did you ever find out what was troubling him from his past?
Yeah, I think there were many things troubling him. I think that the 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 biggest was the fact that he was at his core a deeply emotional human being that had no outlet to express those emotions. So what do you do with that? Well, what do you do with those emotions and that pain that you're feeling? You mute them. That's what many men of that era and many Ozarks guys did. You muted that pain by drinking or hunting or shooting at something, whatever it was, to make that go away for the moment. Never, Kathy, as you know, takes care of the issue or the problem, but at the moment it does. And that's what he did. And ironically, toward the end of his life, he drank less.
That's interesting because he was speaking a little bit more
He
about his
was,
emotions.
yeah,
That's so interesting. Ollie, I think we have another question. What qualities of your father's parenting are
wow,
you most thankful for? Wow, that's a really good question.
a great question.
Yeah.
There are many actually. One would be his his teaching me to have a respect for where I was raised and the people who raised me. The Ozarks gets a very bad rap through TV shows, and it becomes a punchline. But there are many, many, many incredible people who live there. And I didn't want to make them a joke, a punchline in this book. My dad taught me a respect for where I was raised and the environment and the beauty of the place in which I was raised. And the other was financial. My father, I thought for so much of my childhood, was just being mean. When he took my money. Had a paper route. He took that money. I worked jobs. He took that money from me. He took it. I mean, he was like my pimp, and he would put it in a bank or a savings account. He invested it for me at an early age. He bought me a car at 16, but I had to pay that car off and the insurance. But my father taught me that. I learned and believed because his parents went through depression. They lost everything. They had very little. They saved tinfoil. They had to hunt to eat. He did not want his son to go through that in his own life. So it was an odd and hard way to teach me economics and how to live. But financially, he put me on a path that made me very secure at a much earlier age. He made me incredibly responsible. And that helped. I told him toward the end of his life, that has made me, I think, part of my success as an author is it is an unusual job with an unusual pay structure. And
Right.
the business of being an author is very important. And I don't think I would be where I am had he not taught me how to approach my life financially. That was a huge part.
Did he smile when you said that to him?
He did. He did. He was very proud of that. I mean, my dad loved, as much as baseball, he loved to talk about stocks and what he invested in before, in the time, my gosh, I got Walmart stock, when there was maybe a half dozen Walmarts in the country. Those things, he worked very hard and he saved his money. He never enjoyed his money, but he saved his money, and that made him safe and secure and comfortable. And I understood why he did that, because he was taught to be fearful growing up. He was worried he used to always say it could go away like that.
Right. I know we have one last question. Ollie, can you okay. How did you decide to use the Yogi Berra quote at the beginning of the book? It's a great one.
Yeah, it's talking about love and baseball, and Yogi Berra is famous for his non sequiturs and a lot of that. But I was kind of going back through all of the famous Cardinals players and famous players in baseball, and I happened upon that quote very early when I started writing the book, and it just summed the book up perfectly. So I thought it fit beautifully.
It's perfect. So again, we at A Mighty Blaze love bookshop.org because it'll find an indie for you, or you can just walk down to your local indie and buy it. Actually, you should buy all of Wade's books and all of Viola Shipman's book, but particularly this book is just wonderful, totally wonderful. I want to thank all of you who are here listening in. This is going to be on our YouTube A Mighty Blaze station forever, so you can put comments up there too. And I especially want to thank Ollie, our producer, for doing another exceptional job and saving me every moment. And I want to really thank Wade for just being, I don't know, just such a great friend from the moment I first met you and Gary way at the Pulpwood Queens years and years ago. I've just loved you both. And this has just been a thrill. Thank you so, so much, Wade.
Thank you very much. There's a reason that people meet, and I'm glad you've saved me many times over the course of my life and career.
I'm
So
so
I can never
glad.
thank you enough.
Oh, always. Anything for you. Everybody's saying, thank you, Wade. Great interview. Okay, everybody. We'll see you next time. Good afternoon.